When I was a kid, I had a bunch of VHS tapes for Thomas and Friends. Thomas along with VeggieTales were what I mostly watched as a kid, and years later, I'm still into Thomas. While I don't have the VHS tapes anymore, I still have vivid memories of some of the tapes I had. And in terms of the Thomas tapes, one that stood out to me was Spills and Chills and Other Thomas Thrills, which had season 5 episodes. When it comes to the 5th season of Thomas and Friends, everyone seems to have one particular episode that really sticks with them. This season is filled with lots of memorable episodes, many of which are considered some of the best the show has to offer, and for good reason. Whether it's over-the-top crashes, humor, intense situations, or spooky stuff, or just a mix of the four, there's bound to be an episode in this season that would appeal to any fan of the show. And the episode from Series 5 that sticks with me the most is Duncan Gets Spooked. If I were to make a countdown of my favorite episodes of this show, this episode would definitely make it into the top 5, maybe even top 3. In terms of the more spooky episodes, Duncan Gets Spooked is definitely my favorite. Percy's Ghostly Trick may be the first spooky episode I remember watching, but I think Duncan Gets Spooked has more meat on its bones than Percy's Ghostly Trick. So, let's start talking about why this episode stuck with me so much and why it still sticks with me as an adult. The episode starts with Peter Sam being pushed by Rusty to refill on water, and while he's getting his drink, the troublesome trucks that he's pulling decide that they've been waiting long enough. So they're able to break away because of their heavy loads of branches and the old couplings they have. When the trucks reach the old iron bridge, they fall into the swamp below, along with all the cargo they were carrying. Back at the sheds, Sir Topham Hatt reprimands Peter Sam, and not his crew since, well, his crew admitted that they didn't secure the couplings properly, and it also didn't help that the couplings they were using were old and rusty, so I don't know why Sir Topham Hatt is reprimanding Peter Sam and not his crew. Anyway, Duncan teases Peter Sam about the incident, mentioning the ghosts of the trucks that Peter Sam was coupled to would come back to haunt him. Rusty, clearly having enough of his BS, decides to tell Duncan a story about an engine who fell off the old iron bridge. Long ago, a little engine was making its way back home on a misty night. When he tried crossing the bridge, the engine derailed and fell into the swamp below. He was never saved, unfortunately, but when the moon is full, the staff working near the bridge would see the spirit of the little engine crossing the bridge, but never making it across. I'll talk more about this particular scene later. Duncan brushes off the story and goes on about his work. Peter Sam's crew talk to Duncan's crew, and they decide to play a prank on Duncan. The first step is making Duncan cross the old iron bridge, and while Duncan brushes off the story once again, as the day goes by, Rusty's story continues to play on his mind. When the sun is about to set, he and his crew have to wait for their trucks at the slate quarry. Duncan complains that he wants to leave as soon as possible so Skarloey doesn't take his favorite spot in the shed, but his crew can see that their prank is working since Duncan is visibly nervous. At night, Duncan leaves the slate quarry, and let me just say here, I absolutely love this shot. Duncan stops halfway on the bridge, and up ahead, he sees flickering lights that make up the shape of an engine, but to his driver, they're just fireflies. His driver throws a rock into the swamp, and terrified, Duncan reverses away from the bridge. Back at the sheds, his driver asks Duncan if he's spooked, and Duncan just responds that he's asleep. But Duncan opens his eyes, just to see if his driver is still there. Now, the story of this episode is pretty similar to Percy's Ghostly Trick, since it's a character playing a ghost prank on another character, but there are some things about this episode that just make it better in my eyes. First off, we actually see what happens to the ghost engine. Like, we really see an engine die. When I first saw this episode and this part played, I think this was the first time I remember getting genuinely invested in a story being told to me through a show or a movie. From Rusty telling the story about the ghost engine to Duncan, to the engine crossing the old iron bridge, and the engine falling into the swamp below. It's a moment that stuck with me for so long, not just for the visuals, but for the music here. It's a haunting and somber track that just lingers in my brain, to the point I'll occasionally hum this song to myself every now and then. I really don't think I'd remember this scene the way I do now if it wasn't for this track. And back to the engine falling into the swamp, at that point in my life when I first saw this episode, I had never encountered death before. And while I definitely didn't understand what death actually was at that time, I think this was my first exposure to death. Death is something nobody really wants to think about, but I think it's important for children's shows to show death in a tasteful way to the children who would be watching so they can get a better understanding of it as they get older. And another aspect that's so effective about this episode, it's never confirmed if Rusty's story is for real or not. In Percy's Ghostly Trick, we're told at the beginning of the episode that the story Percy told was a pretend ghost from his driver. But here, in Duncan Gets Spooked, we don't know if this engine actually worked on this railway, if it even existed at all, or if it's just something Rusty made up to scare Duncan. It really gets you thinking, like, did Rusty just make it up on the fly, or did someone else tell him the story? Or is it actually real, and the engine's ghost haunting the bridge was the part Rusty made up? We're never told. And really, I think that's what makes this episode so effective. It doesn't hold back on its dark and eerie story, but still remains tasteful enough for its target audience, and gets you thinking about the story Rusty told. It is, in my eyes, the peak of the spooky episodes of Thomas and Friends. Not because it's necessarily scary, but because of its story, music, and visuals that will stick with the viewer. It really is a fine example of what Series 5 of Thomas and Friends is capable of. Hi guys. So I've kind of been slacking on YouTube content, and part of that had to do with me being unmotivated to do it, and also because I recently started playing The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. So yeah, that's been taking up most of my free time lately. But I've wanted to do these analysis/review videos since I started the channel, and I think talking about this episode was a good start for that. So hopefully I can get more ideas for videos, especially ones that are Thomas related, and that I can stay motivated for this. I'm thinking of streaming more often, so I think at some point I want to do a playthrough of Dark Souls since I never played the game before, despite playing a few Souls-like games already. So whether it's day or night, whatever time it is for you, have a good one.